had never been one for superstitions. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, my life had been filled with the usual rigors of middle-class existence. School, work, relationships, the occasional vacation. Ghosts and curses? They were just stories, told by parents to scare their children, or by Hollywood to make a quick buck. But then, I received the letter, and everything changed. It was a typical Monday morning, the kind that makes you question why you even bother getting out of bed. I was running late, fumbling with my coffee mug and car keys, when I noticed an envelope lying on the doormat. The envelope was thick, made of yellowed parchment that felt out of place in the age of emails and instant messaging. My name was written in a flowing, almost calligraphic script. Thomas King. I opened it without much thought, expecting some kind of spam or an invitation to a high school reunion. Instead, what I found was an invitation of a very different kind. Dear Mr. King, it has come to our attention that you are the sole heir to the Ashwood estate, located in the small town of Greenville, South Carolina. We invite you to visit the property at your earliest convenience. All necessary arrangements have been made for your stay. Sincerely, Henderson & Co., attorneys at law. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a scam. I had no relatives in South Carolina, at least none that I knew of. But curiosity got the better of me. After all, who would go through the trouble of sending such an elaborate invitation if there wasn't something to it? And truth be told, the idea of inheriting an estate, however unlikely, was tempting. 2 days later, I found myself on a plane to Greenville, still unsure why I was going. Maybe it was the monotony of my life, the routine that I was desperate to escape. Or perhaps it was the nagging feeling that something about this was real, something that I needed to see for myself. Greenville was nothing like Chicago. The town had an air of quiet desolation, as if time had forgotten it. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, most of them boarded up or falling into disrepair. The few people I saw seemed to move slowly, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. It was unsettling, to say the least. I rented a car and followed the GPS directions to Ashwood Lane, a narrow, winding road that led into the dense woods on the outskirts of town. The trees formed a thick canopy overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the wind. After about 20 minutes, I arrived at the estate. The Ashwood house stood at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The house itself was massive, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the once grand porch was sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But even in its dilapidated state, there was something majestic about it, a sense of history, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. I parked the car and approached the front door, which creaked open before I could even knock. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of dust and decay. I stepped into the foyer, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The interior was as grand as the exterior, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and faded wallpaper that hinted at a time of opulence long past. As I explored the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the broken windows sent a shiver down my spine. But there was no one else here, just me and the ghosts of a forgotten past. "Welcome, Mr. King." I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice came from behind me, cold and detached. I turned around to see a man standing in the doorway, dressed in a black suit that seemed as old as the house itself. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, as if he hadn't slept in years. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm Mr. Henderson, the attorney who sent you the letter." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "You could have knocked." "My apologies," he replied, though there was no trace of sincerity in his voice. "I wanted to meet you here to explain the situation." "What situation?" I asked, my curiosity now tinged with unease. He motioned for me to sit down in one of the dusty armchairs in the parlor. "The Ashwood estate has been in your family for generations, passed down from one heir to the next. But there's a reason no one has claimed it in years." I raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Henderson leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The house is cursed, Mr. King. Everyone who has ever lived here has met a tragic end." I laughed, though it came out more nervous than I intended. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Henderson said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But I do expect you to listen." Over the next hour, Henderson told me the history of the Ashwood house, a tale so dark and twisted that it felt like something out of a Gothic novel. The house had been built in the late 1800s by my great-great-grandfather, a man named Jeremiah King, who had made his fortune in the railroad business. But Jeremiah was not a kind man. He was ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to amass his wealth, including cheating, lying, and even killing. According to Henderson, Jeremiah had made a deal with a local witch, a woman named Eliza Blackwood, to ensure his success. In exchange for her help, he promised her a share of his fortune. But when the time came to fulfill his end of the bargain, Jeremiah betrayed her, having her burned at the stake as a witch. With her dying breath, Eliza cursed the house, vowing that no one who lived there would ever know peace. Over the years, the curse had claimed many victims. Jeremiah himself died under mysterious circumstances, his body found hanging from the rafters of the attic. His descendants fared no better, each one meeting a grisly end, from suicides to freak accidents. The last person to live in the house was my uncle, who disappeared without a trace when I was just a child. By the time Henderson finished his story, I was shaken. I wanted to laugh it off, to call it a load of nonsense. But something in his eyes told me he believed every word. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the last of the King bloodline," Henderson replied. "And the house has chosen you." "Chosen me? For what?" Henderson stood up, straightening his suit. "To break the curse." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the dim light of the dying day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the old, musty bed in the master bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying Henderson's words in my mind. "The house has chosen you. To break the curse." What did that even mean? I decided to explore the house further, hoping to find some answers. The creaky floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way through the dark hallways. The house seemed to come alive at night, the shadows shifting and whispering as if they had a life of their own. I eventually found myself in the attic, the place where Jeremiah King had met his end. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams overhead were covered in cobwebs. In the center of the room was an old trunk, the kind you see in movies, filled with forgotten treasures or dark secrets. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside, I found a collection of old journals, their pages yellowed with age. They belonged to Jeremiah King, chronicling his rise to power and the deal he had made with Eliza Blackwood. The entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with paranoid ramblings about the curse and the witch's revenge. As I read through the journals, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. The more I learned about Jeremiah's descent into madness, the more I felt a connection to him, as if the house was trying to pull me into its dark history. I could feel the curse closing in on me, the weight of generations of suffering bearing down on my shoulders. But it wasn't until I found the final entry that I realized the true nature of the curse. She is still here, watching, waiting. I hear her in the walls, in the wind. She won't let me go. None of us will ever be free. Not until the blood debt is paid. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see the ghost of Jeremiah King or the witch herself. But there was no one there, just the darkness, closing in on me. I stumbled back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of this house, to leave Greenville and never look back. But as I reached the front door, I found it locked. The key wouldn't turn, no matter how hard I tried.